Possibly the best analogy I've ever read regarding shadow work comes from William Miller's Your Golden Shadow, and it's his analogy of the shopkeeper that I'll expand on here. This will help to explain how you've come to accept certain traits or parts of yourself, why you might find it difficult to see other traits within yourself, or why you might view some of them as negative, and why this process happens to us all. So firstly, imagine that you are new in town and you have just set up a shop. So as a new shopkeeper, you're not sure what will sell, what won't, and what's just going to be completely ignored. So to stay in business, you can't just keep stocking the shop with items that you like. You have to cater to the public. So what's going to happen is they're the ones with the money and they're the ones who are going to keep you in business. So we have to stock up our shelves. Some things are going to go by the front of the till and some a few rows back, and some at the back of the shop up until the shop is going to be full with just an assortment of very different items. And after a few weeks of business, it becomes quite clear most customers like this item, let's say the chair for the sake of this, and they don't particularly like this other item, let's say this little suit of armour that I'll just put over here on the other side of the video. So as we move this item closer to the counter, we end up pushing this one further away. And there's the important part, given that this is what the public are choosing. There are also some items in the shop that even though the customers don't seem to like them, that you like them. So you keep experimenting with different items, putting some closer to the till in hopes that people will buy them. And sometimes this works and you're happy to sell those items and the public are happy to buy such an item. And maybe your shop even becomes known for selling that item. That's great. But sometimes we put an item on the shelf and we expect the public to like it, but the opposite happens. So let's say this mask is the example here. Let's say the public actually hate this item. They threaten to stop coming back to this shop up until this item is taken down. And remember, we want to stay in business. So of course, this customer is right. So as a result, out it goes. And so it goes on. So some items take up 10 times the amount of shelf space that they started with. Some get put into storage in the back. And every now and again, you decide to put out another item just to spice things up and see what happens, see what the public opinion is. Let's use the microscope for this example. So in this case, the item isn't loved and in high demand, but it's not particularly hated either. It just sits on the shelf being completely ignored by the public. So it might be that we actually really like this item and we get confused why other people don't. But remember, this is a business that we're running, so the profit is the most important thing to keep in mind. So we might keep this on the shelf a little bit longer than planned, but ultimately it gets silently packed away and it gets put into the back. It's not hated, it's just ignored. And let's say time goes on, you stay in business for 7 years and you decide to look back over your accounts. The shop might or might not have looked like what you originally intended when you set it up to begin with, but that's not what's important. What's important is that you are still in business. There are some things that you are happy to sell, and there's some things that you're less sure of, but the point is you're still selling. Your shop stayed in business through a process of trial and error. You couldn't have known on day one what year 7 would have looked like, but every choice that you made to keep your shop made sense on a day-to-day basis in order to keep the business running. And what kept your shop running was that you updated your shelves according to the specific needs of the specific buyers in the area where you happen to set up that shop. You don't get to dictate what their preferences are. You just have to adapt, or not adapt, to stay in business. So hopefully the analogy is quite clear in terms of where I'm going with this in terms of the shadow. So over time, we remove the unwanted items from the shelves that people don't want to buy in exactly the same way that we hide away certain traits or characteristics or interests or talents, anything from our caregivers as we develop, if it doesn't please the caregiver. We can't force this customer to buy the product, and we can't force the caregiver to share the same interests and traits that we have. There's nothing wrong with the customer, it's their preference. In the same way, there's nothing wrong with the caregiver. They've just got a different set of traits, ideas, or opinions. And just like we move some of those items away and eventually put them into storage, we do the same thing with our certain traits and characteristics when we grow up if they aren't best sellers. And in a very real sense, our personality, or the parts that we're consciously identified with, develop in the same way that ensure that we get our needs met. This isn't a perfect process, and it depends on our specific circumstances, the families that we're born into, the country, the culture, the time period, the environment, everything all around us. And that is the key point. So to quote directly from William Miller in his book on page 7, just this little simple part at the very bottom here, it is largely the immediate environment that determines what gets developed into conscious personality and what gets rejected into our shadow. Nothing about these traits are inherently good or bad, but rather they'll become integrated into our self-image or pushed out into the shadow according to trial and error. And this process happens to all of us, though in practice it might look very, very different from person to person. But there's also one final point to note here, is that sometimes, as the shopkeeper, we might have put some items into storage that we didn't like and the public didn't like. That's fine, that's no problem. But sometimes we actually really like these items. So when we put them away, we very reluctantly put them away. Let's take this microscope as an example again here. So it might be that we really like this item. We very reluctantly box it up. But the good news is that this item, it's not destroyed. It's not gone forever. It's sat waiting in that same box that you left it, waiting to be opened. So maybe after 25 or 30 years of business, you pack up and you move your shop elsewhere. Let's represent it by this other little building here. So let's say here, after 25, 30 years of business, you pack up, you've set up this new shop, it's a new location, you've got new customers, so we've got a new public over here, and they've got new preferences. So maybe that boxed up item, which was hated in that first location, is maybe a best seller in this second. And this represents the potential of the golden shadow, which is exactly what the book is all about. So hopefully this process of shadow work is a little bit clearer for you in terms of what the shadow represents and how it got to be shadow material to begin with. And if you enjoyed this analogy, by the way, you'll enjoy the playlist that I'm currently creating, where I'm trying to explain various concepts from psychology and philosophy books, which can be used to help guide your self-discovery and your inner journey. And you can access all of this just to the right or at the end of this video. But just to finish this particular video, I just want to leave you with a simple thought, which is this. Well, what is it that you very reluctantly packed up into storage? What might happen if you decide to open it back up? Maybe not necessarily for retail to the public, but just for yourself. Would you be willing to open up that box again? This is your choice.